Hello and welcome to Making Medicine Better. I'm David Morris, and this week I'm joined by Mark, Wilby, Lorna, Kirti and Igor, and we're going to be talking about digital therapeutics and their impact on the field of mental health and brain health.
Let's do it.
We're going to end up down a rabbit hole, and that's fine. Igor, what are digital therapeutics?
Well, digital therapeutics are an exciting new treatment modality that has become of age in the last, I would say, probably not more than a decade. Essentially, with digital transformation in healthcare, we have a lot of different data streams in healthcare and medical care. That data can be used to help drive some of the kind of digital therapeutics, where a patient, with a particular condition, let's take, for example, depression, could either instead or in addition to doing some of the traditional treatments, like taking an antidepressant medication or doing psychotherapy, they could also use an app on their phone that has been validated, hopefully. But these kind of digital therapeutics can be applied. There are many startups, many companies that are working on a variety of conditions, metabolic health and diabetes, to help with behavioral changes related to diabetes. Mental health is big in digital therapeutics.
So in a line, basically, it's a treatment. It's a medical treatment or a clinical treatment delivered by a digital means.
Exactly, correct. So,
Go on.
One other important one that I think is gaining a lot of traction now is virtual reality. So virtual reality, where you have headsets that kind of create simulated environments, are being used. For example, I'm familiar with a couple of startups. One is using it for helping with pain. They actually ran a clinical trial where using a virtual headset prior and during surgical procedures that don't require general anesthesia, those patients that use virtual reality required less pain medications throughout the procedure and after the procedure. Another company is using virtual reality to help address the loneliness pandemic, loneliness crisis among older adults. So there's just a lot of unique, interesting applications.
Okay. Is there a threshold for what a digital therapeutic is? Because there's loads of apps. Like there's 500,000 healthcare apps out there, health apps of different guises, right? So when we classify something as a digital therapeutic, does that mean that it's regulated? Does that mean that it's scientifically proven? Does that mean that it's of clinical grade? Or is digital therapeutic just another relatively broad term for a type of health app?
This is an evolving field, right? There are no hard-coded definitions, but if you take nonprofit organizations that are kind of leading the way, like I mentioned, Digital Medicine Society, they classify digital therapeutics as something that has the highest level of regulation that is regulated. So, and I think the FDA is also coming. They haven't clarified exactly, but they tend to also say that if you kind of imply that it's a treatment, that it's a therapeutic, then it has to be validated and approved in some way. Whereas if it's a consumer app, just kind of like vitamins, right? But on vitamins, you can, at least in the US, there's a disclaimer that says this supplement doesn't diagnose, treat, or prevent any disease. And so I would imagine kind of that's an analogy for consumer apps, that yes, it's a mental health app, but you're not allowed to say that it will help your depression. Whereas for something like digital therapeutics, it would be a regulated product or service that has been validated and approved for a specific condition.
I think also they're typically prescribed, which I think is what makes them distinct from, kind of consumer pull, is that they're adopted into kind of healthcare organizations and used as part of a kind of treatment plan. So they can be, kind of digital formulary where they have a suite of digital therapies that they've that are evidence-based, and there's a kind of efficacy around them, and they understand them relative to, which patient might benefit. And there's ways of, it's in the same ways you would write a script for, some kind of medication. You could potentially identify certain patient cohorts that you would say we might, I think Decor's, we might prescribe a lower dose of a medication, and we'd like you to try a therapy as complementary, and we'd like you to kind of use them together for a while. So I think they are, they're basically prescribed, and that digital formulary kind of principle of, that they're regulated and they are evidence-based. And so people kind of retrieve them and use them. Patients, so they have a lot more credibility because they're kind of they're introduced to patients through their kind of care team, their healthcare professional, versus, going on the app store.
So it's kind of akin to the model that they're using. I'd be familiar with the model that they're using in Germany at the moment around the DIGA, where they do an assessment of the digital tools that they've got. And if you meet a certain evidence criteria, if you meet a certain value, then a doctor in Germany can prescribe an app instead of a medication, and the health service will fund that prescription. They'll pay for that app for the patient. The same as in the UK, where I think they've recently approved a sleep app in the NHS to help people sleep. It's when you hit an evidence base and a kind of a critical mass of all of the criteria that they've got, then you can be used in a clinical way, as opposed to, as you say, you're just finding something somewhere in the app store and you're not sure if it's any good or not. Okay.
One thing that I think the digital therapeutics field is struggling with right now is that just because it is approved by a regulatory body like the FDA doesn't necessarily mean that it will be reimbursed. And so you kind of, you mentioned all of that as part of DIGA, but just because it's approved by DIGA or the FDA, the healthcare insurers may or may not pay for that, and that will affect whether it's going to be adopted clinically. Because, first of all, certainly like regulation makes it easier is a requirement for doctors to prescribe it, because doctors won't prescribe anything really that is not approved by regulatory body, because just for liability. But even if it is approved, it may not. A lot of patients may not benefit from it, because if it ends up being an out-of-pocket cost and it's thousands of dollars, then it may not be feasible for a lot of patients to have access to it.
Okay.
I think you said, Lorna, that it's or also you said at Igor, it's not for everybody, so you cannot just download it from the App Store. But why not? I mean, what's the you have a benefit ratio, but are there any risks also to having such an app? I mean, people get referred to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, for a first intake. So what about just having everybody get to the app and at least do like a first intake to just see, if the app is providing anything that they can benefit from?
I mean, I think, and please, anybody feel free to jump in, but I think with anything, potentially there are risks and benefits, right? So let me give you an example. So if you take specifically with mental health, if you take an app that is not evidence-based and you say you're going to take somebody with a history of PTSD, trauma, and have them go through this process, and let's say they say, I'm going to use this app, and I'm going to forego my regular treatment instead of this because I feel more comfortable with the app. It's a loss of opportunity, loss of time. This patient may not be getting any effective treatment during that time. In addition, let's say the patient has severe trauma and this app somehow inappropriately elicits their trauma and makes them worse. Right? So
I think particularly for I think, particularly in the area of mental health, I think there's a lot of anxiety around outsourcing more, too much of that service, that care to tech. I think there's just that sense that, are we ready to outsource it? So there's a lot of tethering used in terms of, someone using, what's great about using a kind of digital therapy is that there's kind of real-time feedback. And so, that the kind of use of it is trackable. There's a lot of kind of being able to track utilization. An awful lot of kind of medications, you're given a medication, it takes weeks, if not months, to kind of determine if it's actually working. It's a little bit kind of, there's not a lot of, the patient himself is kind of trying to kind of refer, or kind of the efficacy of the drug can be kind of pretty vague. And digital therapeutics, there's a lot of kind of real-time feedback in terms of the patient using it, the level of engagement, the kind of stickiness of it. So there's a kind of lot of oversight. I think the oversight is actually because people want to learn, I would say, because they're so nascent. I think there's a sense that let's watch people using it, and you can tweak it as well, and a lot of the therapies, they themselves inside the algorithm, depending on what the patient does, they're very responsive. So different to medications where you just get given a drug that everyone gets given the same drug. The therapy can respond to how you use it, and it can kind of calibrate itself. And so it's much more dynamic as a treatment. But I think because it's really early, there's that sense of, to Igor's point, I think that we need to have it observed and a lot of oversight because we don't necessarily want to outsource.
That's kind of funny. That's kind of funny that you're saying this, because if it can actually regulate and it can switch based on the behavior of the user, then that's also an infringement on the evidence base. Because the way now therapy or medicine is being evaluated, of course, so you have the gold standard of the clinical trial, and then you have the real world evidence, and then you have years and years of tracking. But if you have an algorithm that can actually respond and can learn itself by how it thinks it should respond, then you are touching the boundaries of an evidence base quite soon, because you have no idea how the algorithm will behave. Because there are no boundaries set. That's not the way that we do the evidence base. So I was wondering, as you were talking, Lorna, is that what's the role of the professional? So let's say, what's the role of the psychologist, psychiatrist? Do they have to be on par with this app? Do they have to be consolidated? Do they get all the data? So how does that actually work? Or Igor, if you have any idea of the rest. So how does that now symbiose the human and the tech?
So I mean, I think what Lorna mentions, I think, is a minority of these apps. Most of them do not. Most of them are basically tested and developed. Well, they're not developed, but they're tested like in similar clinical trials like drugs are, right? It's a one size fits all kind of thing, right? Most of these digital therapeutics are not what's called adaptive, right? The term is adaptive, right? So, but increasingly with VR and some of these digital therapeutics, some companies are using data science and AI, machine learning to evaluate the ongoing stream of data from these apps and how the patient is responding and adapt. But I mean, to Lorna's point, she's right, but Mark, you're also right, because I think ethically and as far as legally within regulations, you would actually probably have to do a clinical or a real-world trial that incorporates that in the clinical trial design, the adaptive design, right? So you couldn't do a one-size-fits-all. You couldn't do a clinical trial with 1,000 patients, one-size-fits-all approach, and then 2 months later start putting a deep learning AI algorithm that adapts to each user. In fact, according to the FDA, that would be considered a software as a medical device. So that would have to be approved in itself. And the adaptive nature may have to be also tested in a clinical trial.
I think we were covering like so many like parallel streams there. I think, Mark, to your point in terms of like the interventions. So I think defining that intervention. I think if you're designing a research protocol which is prepared for comparative adaptiveness, then it can work. But the problem when you then look at that is then you need to have huge scale. So not quite in the digital therapeutics, but I've looked at that in terms of behavioral medicine and exercise and physical activity. And then we're needing to look at a trial of maybe 5,000 individuals that we're then looking at comparative adaptiveness, where you're mapping your temporal interactions with your individual, and maybe between those temporal time points they might have different experiences, but you have a standardized set of outcomes, and at the end of the intervention you could reflectively look back within your groups and say, this group at the end has received this, their journey to there was different, and the way that they received that was different, but I can quantify this. And we're not designed for that, because then it comes back into how do we do the probability around that? How do we do the trial design? How do we do the stats? It's not simple group comparisons. And then what Lorna describes is the future and the potential of the device. But then when it comes back to the real world, then we're talking about the framework and the translation and the implementation science. So it's just like, and that's where I struggle actually at the minute. And Kurti and I have had the privilege of kind of being around this a little bit and seeing it kind of within the Global Brain Health Network and seeing lots of interesting opportunities or areas emerging around both mental health and then early diagnostics for cognitive decline. But the challenge that I felt was like, what's actually under this box and how do I use it as a professional, and how do I build it within a framework, and what if this journey stops within that box and actually this person needs more? So, you know, their severity is more than what the treatment's offered within that digital therapeutic. So to summarize that, we've got a lot going on there. There's the frameworks, there's the pathways, and then there's our science needs to adapt and get up to speed a little bit better to be able to deal with this.
Yeah, I think it's like the idea of a clinical trial that is kind of coming out of the tradition of how we run trials, and then the appropriateness of the clinical trial model, you know, when you think about kind of digital therapies, because, you know, from you know, my understanding and some stuff, you know, that I'm kind of aware of, is that one of the things that is most attractive about digital therapies is how personalized they become. Like they aren't kind of standard, you know, you kind of get a medication and the most that can be kind of personalized is maybe the dosage. So you're going to get like, you know, X amount of milligrams versus someone else, but you're still getting the same drug. And then it's versus a digital therapy that as you use it, it starts to really refine and it becomes very much about you and that technology. And it's quite that kind of coupling is very intimate, and it really reflects just, you know, you using that tool in the same way as different people picking up different tools and using them. It's always going to be expressed in a different way, and that's actually considered the most interesting aspect of it. Is it's not, you know, a kind of one size fits all, but then I get to that point, you know, the kind of tradition of an awful lot of what is kind of considered, you know, kind of proof is being able to hold a standard and saying this is the standard of proof, and so everything has to be standardized, and so it's actually quite contrary in terms of its in principle, but
because it's what you want, it's what you want, this kind of personalized medicine. I mean, that's one of the things that we're still not able to do, especially when we do statistics on clinical trials. It's still large group statistics, and even if you have huge trials and huge meta-analyses and a large database of real-world evidence, I've yet to meet the physician who is able to really pinpoint on what a certain kind of treatment will do for a certain kind of person at a certain kind of time to a very accurate point. So if you're able to do it, and then of course you always have a little bit of the placebo effect, in the sense that, you know, you have an app that's tracking you, that's supporting you, and that's perhaps, you know, in a certain feeling there for you. And so even if it's not that evidence-based, or part of it is not that evidence-based, if you feel that you benefit from it, then it is beneficiary.
The placebo is a real thing. I mean, that's the mind-body connection. Like it's like, you know, the mind and body have a very powerful relationship in terms of believing and it affecting your kind of, you know, your mind can actually really affect your physiology. So, yeah, I think
actually many of the antidepressants are actually. Many widely used antidepressants are only something like 5 to 10% better than placebo, which is, you know, striking, you know. And so, and I mean, the other thing about is, again, I mean, most of these digital therapeutics, while they are to some degree personalized, because it's easier personalized than, you know, and faster to personalize than spending 18 months trying to figure out what dosage of Lexapro to go on and wait for it to affect. But most of these they're not adaptive, most of them. In mental health, some of them are adaptive, but I think that's like an increasing trend. And I think you really need to have that, explicitly have that as part of your clinical trial design or real world evidence study design, because otherwise what is approved and what is being used are not going to be aligned, right? And that's going to be a problem. So,
and I think one of the things is that, again, just coming back from my experience in the behavioral field, is like, and doing those meta-analyses and those types of things, is that it's actually really hard to at the start to map what the domains of your intervention or your components are going to be. You know, exercise, real simple way to put it: frequency, intensity, time, and type. That kind of break down into a lot around a number of our kind of behavioral type of interventions. So the intensity of the therapy, the frequency of the therapy, the time with the professional, the intensity of the provider, or the qualifications of the provider, so type, is it supervised, non-supervised, all those types of things. And sometimes it's actually, my concern would be who's developing the products and how the products are coming to the market, and are they thinking about that as they're developing the product? Because it's easier to think about it and to capture what the domains you are that you're tweaking and work, so as you're building that algorithm to deliver a personalized or smart approach to the therapy, we should also be thinking, okay, what's this algorithm? What are the covariants? What are the determinants? And then you then break it down as it's live to capture the buckets of domains of activity.
But this is really interesting stuff, Wilby. Also, what Igor was telling in the beginning about virtual reality or the metaverse. I mean, I've known a company in the Netherlands that has actually built these digital avatars that function as a digital version of a personal trainer or a digital version of a psychologist, and then via that avatar, so the avatar actually becomes the digital therapeutic. Because via that avatar you get supported, you get messages, you have to remember that you have to take a certain kind of drug, or that you have to do a certain kind of protocol, or it supports you. So via that you get like a digital friend or a digital professional that supports you in your goal. And so via that route, I mean, there's a lot that we can do also for healthcare. But if you want to track the evidence, and you want to see how certain variations, certain changes, that's a lot of data collection you have to do. And so if you kind of bump also into the legal stuff and the regulatory stuff, then I think you come in this very, very tight niche of how much freedom do you have to test if something actually can or cannot work, via also, the real possibility of something hurting, like Igor already mentioned, stopping, your already known treatment. So I've always found it to be in digital to be quite challenging, in which innovation gets also hindered by legislation, which we still need. But it also lacks, our chances of seeing if this actually does something or not.
And that's again back in that kind of behavioral world, and I'm sure this will, as are different opportunities for digital therapeutics advance. So like one of the things is life logging, but using imaging for life logging. So wearable cameras, and that wearable camera then provides you with this contextual information that as behavioral scientists we're just blind to. And it also gives this opportunity for feedback back to the individual in terms of how they're interacting with their environment, or how they're interacting with their behaviors. And when I was back in Oxford and we were looking within the British Heart Foundation Health Promotion Research Group, we were trying to look at how could we use these technologies and look at them within the context of physical activity. And it's actually legislation that was the challenge, because we're capturing images of other people. So the camera's projecting out. We only see the person's hand, or we see how many biscuits they've got, or the drink they have in their hand, or a representation of their physical activity, that they're cycling, they're in the car, these types of things. But actually it's projecting out. So it's capturing others. And then that's where the real regulatory challenges came. And how do we capture that? And then, a university as a sponsor, and what if they actually see a trauma or an event that's being acted upon a other person, and then we have this real-time evidence of that. What do we do with it? So that was something that kind of actually did block that type of progression of that research, or made it too complicated for us in terms of the scale and the budgets and that type of things.
I think also, given the discussion and given the previous discussions we've had, it becomes about how we define healthcare, what are the goals of the health system, and then what do we want these digital technologies to do. And what I sense is that there is no overall systems thinking or systems approach, like which digital technologies should we invest in and why. And from a global health perspective, the danger is the same with drug development, in terms of what you invest in is not necessarily going to lead to better global health, and may perpetuate inequalities in terms of what you actually focus on. So let's take physical activity versus a specific infectious disease. And so I think as part of going forward, it's also, it would be great to have like a systems approach to these digital technologies on a bigger scale, that looks at this and addresses it before it becomes a problem, as it has with drug development.
It's a really good point, Curdy, because then it comes back to where does the responsibility lie in terms of is it regulation, legislation? Is it think tanks, idea generation, that kind of stuff? Because like that context, we were just sitting there excited about like the opportunity of life logging and that it could give us more granularity and information and we could understand it more. And it was so much richer compared to this, questionnaire based format and a paper and pen approach. But then you're totally right. It denies the why, the bias is inherent, and then it denies the wider issues in terms of what's shaping the societal patterns of physical activity. And so that came back down to us as individuals, as opposed to somebody at a macro level going, oh, hey, we should be putting more funds in this direction and that direction. And like, where are we seeing that? Maybe we see it with the World Bank, maybe we see it with who? I mean, it doesn't translate into stuff that I'm seeing, and in real time, in terms of, maybe Bill and Belinda Gates, and when you're thinking about infectious diseases, I don't know.
It's not necessarily that. It was just about like the systems approach about what you invest in, because it's not just financial resources, it's human resources as well, right? And so the question does need to be bigger in terms of this new technology or new therapeutics, in terms of how you actually create a system that looks at it from a bigger scale, that considers all these variables, which I don't see happening. Like what I get a sense of is people have this awesome idea and that's what's going to get investment if they can convince somebody to invest in this idea. But you don't have and this is for health in general, it's not just digital therapeutics, it's just a newish field. So there's the potential to shape it differently.
I think, Kirti, you're right. The whole kind of over-promising of, digital therapeutics, it becomes like a kind of term that people start using, and kind of digital formulary, and understanding that, I think, Igor, to your point, there's the kind of ones that have worked to date have been exposure therapy or distraction therapies. And so I think, Igor, you mentioned some distraction therapies. They use it a lot in kind of burns units when people doing one of the first things with VR was cold scapes, changing kind of doing kind of wound dressing on burn victims, and they just were like, and that's back to just tapping into the kind of mind body. So like visually, if you believe that you're in a certain kind of environment, you can really kind of adapt. You can kind of manifest your body. So distraction techniques, and then exposure therapy. They did an awful lot of things, PTSD, and they used. So there's like limited. There's like some small places where it's been very effective. In terms of like, and again, it's really tapping into, if we can immerse you in a visual environment that kind of triggers you to be either exposed to something or to trick your brain into thinking something, so that your body can actually tolerate some kind of pain or something. And I think one of the earliest digital therapeutics has been biofeedback. That's like a really old one. Like it's fantastic, in terms of thinking about the kind of, being able to use something to kind of, really understand and get kind of vision and kind of affirmation. This kind of externalizing and quantifying and affirmation around what's really happening in biofeedback and kind of lowering heart rate. So there's been some like really niche places that it's been so effective. And I think what's happened is it's probably getting talked about, Kirti, you're right, it's like a silver bullet. And I do think it just needs a lot more research. To your point, it's not ready yet, but I think it's powerful stuff. Like I just think it needs an awful lot more. And then from the research, we need to think about what is a real clinical trial for something like this, because we're going to have to break some orthodoxies, in terms of what's really kind of, how do you prove, when something is effective, when every time it turns up, it's different and there are no standards. But I think there's been some really niche places where it's very effective. And I think people want it to be doing more for, quickly. And I don't think it will. I think it needs a lot more research.
And Lauren, to your point, it's like, who wants it to do more quickly? Like, and I've seen some cynical examples of that kind of in the NHS, where we have a very depleted mental health service and lack of, there's lack of investment across multiple areas across those pathways. And, it was seen as a sticky tape to the front end of those pathways in terms of digital access. So yeah, we can shunt people off into digital counselling services without real, I was at some political meetings where we were hearing that being discussed and the potential of it, and then when you interrogated the politicians' understanding of it, there was no depth, there was no understanding of the potential risks or how you might top and tail that with triage and onward referral and those types of things. So so it's the who wants that quick fix, and then is it a venture capitalist that actually just wants that quick fix? Because
Well, it's also
in the
access.
university and
Because people can't get access to care, so there's a real imperative, like there's a real crisis in terms of access for mental health services. So I think it's less about automating something that's already working really, really well. I think that there's just there's a real crisis around access for mental health services right now.
I want to respond to what Lorna was saying and Curdy. So, some unique things about digital therapy, right? In some ways, the goal of digital therapeutics is to increase access or to supplement in-person care, right? So access is one thing, and one example is in mental health. Again, a lot of these applications are in mental health, which is exciting for me because I love mental health and digital health. But cognitive behavioral therapy. Take cognitive behavioral therapy. It's probably the most evidence-based type of psychotherapy and psychiatry in mental health, used for anxiety, for depression, for all kinds of mental health conditions. And there's quite a bit of evidence now that a digitized version of cognitive behavioral therapy that doesn't require a therapist, there is a strong evidence base that for people that for whatever reason may not have access to a counselor, a mental health therapist, that a digital CBT could be a good option. But just
I'm wondering, Igor, when actually people already start or will start to use Chat GPT for this kind of stuff.
I knew this was going to come up.
Of course.
They're doing it already.
Why not?
Would have to be another follow-up episode, but just kind of briefly to respond to what Kirti was saying, stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, AI and digital health technology, I see it as just a tool. You can have the best AI and virtual reality and digital health tool that is safe and effective, and it may not see the light of day, and it may not have any impact on patient outcomes if a lot of these other things don't happen. And so kind of if you look at the landscape of digital health, it's very fragmented, and it's all over the place as far as policy and insurance reimbursement and all of these things, and adoption. It's all over the place depending on what country you go to. And then what are some challenges in digital health that are unique to digital therapeutics that you don't see with drugs? And just very briefly, I think those are adherence becomes even more of a challenge with digital therapeutics as compared to drugs, because a medication you just take once a day or twice a day. Imagine having to use a digital therapeutics every day for 25 minutes, 3 times a day.
One of the things one of the reasons people are really attracted to digital therapeutics is that kind of non-addicting. I mean, the opioid crisis. I mean, it's not. People are really concerned about the kind of general sense that the default needs to be medication for people, and I think that the pharma companies are probably absolutely. I mean, I think that they're ultimately probably going to buy up a lot of the digital therapeutics, and there's a sense that they may have this kind of combo thing where they'll do pharma and digital. So you'll have a pill with an app, and they'll kind of launch. But it's really about trying to control that market, because there's the kind of non-addicting qualities of digital therapies relative to how addictive some and how expensive. And then and a lot of digital therapeutics, the goal is that you get better over time and you use it less and less and less. And a lot of medications, you just stay on them for the rest of your life. And so it's a very different business model as well. And I think the business model behind these two solutions are really at odds.
So in the Netherlands, it's the same problem. So healthcare, it's a social system. Even there, healthcare is being offered or available to less and less people because of the waiting list. Mental health care is a disaster in that sense. And so we see now the rise of digital devices for telemonitoring, so at home, but a lot also on prevention. So it's digital therapeutics in the sense that we try to monitor people from home, and we try to prevent people actually from going to the hospitals. So actually, doing the best that we can for making sure that people do not have to see a real person. And I see that in the Netherlands happening more and more. I'm actually kind of worried because as a psychologist by training, I do not see that happening. We have digital means of talking to a psychiatrist or psychologist, from your home, but it's a different kind of relationship that you have as a counselor than having these face-to-face sessions, these emotional sessions in which you're actually together. So I'm not sure where that will end up, but yeah, quite exciting it will be. And so in the end, I always hope for that kind of dedicated symbiosis that you were also discussing, Lorna, but not from a business model, or from a model that's best for the patient.
So I think it ties into what I was going to say, actually, because I think one of the other challenges with these systems, digital technology and digital therapeutics and digital technology as a whole, it's based on a value system and a philosophical system that is particular to a part of the world, but it gets exported in the same way to the entire world. And so what happens is the system actually encourages individuality and individual responses versus a community engagement or ensuring that you develop friendship or a relationship, right? If you just look at a simple example like the way we listen to music now versus when we were younger and used to listen to music, how individual that experience has become. And so this is what we're going to translate into healthcare and how damaging that could potentially be. But again, I do think it's also a different philosophical system. In fact, I met a young university student recently who was looking at how to incorporate different African philosophical systems into the designing of AI, because that then would change what these tools actually did.
Yeah, Corday, like you've taken the words out of my mouth a lot more eloquently than I could put them together. But I was kind of thinking along the lines of what is it that. So the example around the music, and you immediately stimulated that vision of me back dancing with my friends, and that kind of that collective experience. And
Too bad, Morrison.
Maybe not that. Well, that's a little bit more quiet, a little bit more sedate. The energy slightly different. I'm maybe thinking more like Mano Chao. But what do we get? Like, that collective energy, the collective experience, that impact that it has on our well-being. And these are things that we can't, it's a little bit like the placebo. These are things that we can't parameterize that well, and we have very little understanding of. And Igor mentioned kind of the potential. Could these technologies support loneliness and social isolation? And I kind of like maybe from a humanity base, hope that we're challenging that a little bit. And I probably echo with Mark a little that actually, what is it that we get from that empathetic interaction and the body language? I think there's languages of our own, like body language. I don't know how to describe that body language. We don't understand what that is. We don't understand these concepts of like the neural reflective system or empathetic charge, all this type of stuff. And suddenly we're just going to ignore all that, subconsciously or unconsciously, because it parked back in the clinic with the group. And we know how effective group systems are. We know how effective group sessions are. We know how effective church and faith-based programs have been. We know how effective community-based programs are, and yet we don't understand why they're effective. We don't understand why the placebo is effective. And so we just have to keep reminding ourselves that there's more to learn. There's more to do. There's more to pull in there in terms of how do we stay, keep humanity in our healthcare and our social initiatives.
I don't think it's trying to replace. I think that this is the kind of general maybe pushback on a lot of digital medicine in general, is that it's mirroring what happens in a room. It's just taken, two people in a room. And I think, Curtis, you're so right, but I think all Western medicine isolates the individual. So I think you're absolutely right. But every single treatment, not exclusively, kind of any kind of therapy, it's so much about the kind of individual being isolated and kind of working on themselves. And so, and I personally don't think that an awful lot of Western kind of psychotherapy works. And so if it was like brilliant medicine and everyone was getting really well really quickly, there wouldn't be this interest in looking at alternative therapies. And so I think it is an area of medicine that is very late to, it hasn't transformed itself in hundreds of years. I mean, it's based on very similar principles that it's been operating under for like 200 years. And so it is very slow to innovate as an area of medicine. It's not surprised people are looking for transformation. They're looking for ways to not just make access better, but it's to actually make the medicine more effective. I mean, some people can't afford to spend 3 years going every Tuesday evening to a therapist and paying to sit in a room, hoping that talking through something and then being on medication is somehow going to help. I mean, that's a big investment. That's a leap of faith, and it's not working for a lot of people. So I think we should acknowledge how this area of medicine really needs to be disrupted. And this may not be the perfect solution, but I think it's really good because it's calling out some of the lack of effectiveness in the existing therapies for people.
Yeah, as far as digital therapeutics replacing traditional therapeutics, I think that's like too broad of a characterization, right? I think like in most things, there's going to be a mixed bag, right? In some things, for some conditions, in some where maybe there are no effective traditional medicines, digital therapeutics may be a first-in-class therapeutic for that is safe or that for that condition. In other cases, digital therapeutics, like in the case for pain and opioid addiction, right? It might offer a similar efficacy therapeutic, but lower risk of adverse effects. And in other cases, it might just be supplemental. So I think it's going to really vary across the board. And one other thing is, there are kind of digital health in general, speaking about humanity that Wilby was mentioning, loneliness is like one example, right? I personally hope that digital technology will increase humanity in healthcare and not the other way around, right? Make it better for clinicians and wellness, make it better for patients and more personalized. But I mean, here's one example where digital health is making a difference. And, I don't know if you've heard of this nonprofit organization called Health Tech Without Borders. I'm recently joined it, and they've been working with providing telehealth and digital health support to humanitarian zones with humanitarian crises. So they started off with the war in Ukraine, and now they've also they've been providing telehealth service and digital health support to that region and Ukraine, but also to responding to the earthquake in Turkey and some other kind of humanitarian disasters. And so the thing about digital health and telemedicine is that it's much more scalable and potentially more efficient than requiring in-person infrastructure and all these things. So there are just a variety of applications where I think digital health will enhance the current healthcare system as long as it's implemented in the right way.
So I think it has lots of potential, but I think if we're not conscious about these challenges and address them directly, we end up mimicking the system we have already. And so you'll have the exact same system in terms of mental health, etc. Because it is also, like we were saying before, in terms of health, it's driven by a capitalist framework, right? So if you're not conscious about what else has to be included, I can't see changing anything in terms of meaningful change. It has the potential, and so that's what we need to focus on.
Well, in that sense, I would say that I think you also mentioned that earlier, Wilby, is that when we have the digital therapeutics, and then coming back to my first question is, to me, they should be available to all. I mean, to an extent that we have to see what they do, but they have to. So if you look at psychological treatment, and if you look at the evidence base for psychology, it's really bad. So the majority of psychology, and then you also mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, Igor. It definitely doesn't work for everything, and it definitely doesn't work for everybody, even though it probably has the highest evidence based that we know of. But if you look at psychological trials, and if you look at the statistics, it's really bad. And it's also so difficult because, as a human, we're very holistic. So if you look at digital therapeutics, they can be used as therapy, but they can also be used to collect a large amount of data on various aspects that we are probably even unable to capture in a clinical trial that we tried to design. So in that sense, perhaps the biggest benefit of any kind of digital intervention would be in its data collection.
It has two sides. If we take to your point, Kirti, that it could actually end up mimicking the current system, taking the pretty poor parts of today's medicine and amplifying that into an enormous problem using the technology. But Mark, I take your point as well, where we could actually, by doing that, then we gather the feedback and the data that we haven't had up to now to learn how to make this better, perhaps. And I think the other thing I've just taken from what you guys were saying there is, really, I think a lot of this stuff is actually that we're just leveraging technology to amplify what we have already had in human medicine to replace the problems that we've created as people and society. So where we have loneliness in society, we think by inventing a technology and making everybody not lonely with a piece of tech, and to Wilby's point, that doesn't replace human energy. The tech, it's better. And I think, Igor, you said it as we went along. If people can't access a therapist, are they better to have some form of a digital therapeutic available to them? If society has created this loneliness, then what do we do? So there's probably a layer where we need to bring it all together, isn't there? Where we need to try and fix the issues in society to address the gaps in access that we have globally, and then use digital in the right way. But I think, Kirti, you said it at the start. What is the framework and the system by which we do that, so we don't just start throwing technology at all of our human issues to try and fix that?
Certainly, if you look at the amount of investment that these venture capitalists and investors have put in over the last 10 years, $100 billion, there are some bright, kind of shining moments of success and improved patient outcomes on a limited basis for certain very narrow groups of patients. But I agree with Kirti that for the amount of money invested so far, we've had relatively little impact. And part of that is simply because it's a very fragmented system, and the adoption is still relatively low, right? So we're at very beginning stages of maybe phase one of this.
Just to come back to Kirti's point about individualism, I think we dropped that a little bit. Individualism and community. And then take that paradigm and then think about Mark's point about, if we're going to use this, let's have universal access. And then I'm thinking about the complexity of individualism as a global society and how it's not really doing the planet very well at the minute. And then just think about the server energy demands and the server capacity that would be needed for everybody to have digital access. So, there's no solution for that. So I think what I think when you think about systems, what is the philosophy of that system? This isn't, I'm not beating up digital technology or digital therapeutics. I'm just saying, how are we going to make this, we've talked about how do we do it and what's the utility and why are we doing it?
I think there's something really, I fundamentally think that it's an area of medicine that teaching people coping mechanisms, like thinking that a solution is taking a person and as an individual, teaching them how to cope versus and that's as much as we can offer them for, and this has been forever. And what's most interesting about kind of digital therapeutics is that there's a capacity to kind of get in and start to retrain your brain and a medicine that's based on the person being able to just manage, to cope, to live with anxiety and depression, to never live without it. It just seems it's really inhumane. I think sitting in a room by yourself is way more isolating than using an app. I mean, if you have to go somewhere and there's a hierarchy that exists inside the kind of therapist patient, that traditional hierarchy is challenging for a lot of patients. And so I think this is a really important disruption that's happening in an area of medicine that's not.
I'm not denying that, Lorna. I think that's actually a potential, but I think it's how do we get there? And how do we get there in an equitable, sustainable fashion where we have addressed all of those issues? And I just don't think that's been discussed. And I definitely don't think the worldview that Curdy's described is even on the table or on the protocol or whatever we'd like to say in terms of thinking about it. But your potential, Lorna, of what you describe in terms of that individual dimension to care is definitely the potential, but how do we get there?
And I think just as an example, it was bringing in sweetness to replace sugar, right? Let's give an alternative that we think is going to be healthier than sugar. But there are health risks associated with it. So it's about considering everything as a whole as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of going back to what I said earlier, is that there are a lot of VCs and a lot of technologists get excited about AI and digital health, and this is a cool device that can change medicine, but healthcare, as we discussed, is not a very specialized industry. It is a specialized industry, but it's related to all aspects of life, of our living, to our to our demographics, where we live, our social determinants of health, the policymakers, right? Healthcare and health is not in a vacuum by itself. It's related to all other aspects of our living. And so technology by itself won't change. Cool technology by itself, for the sake of technology, won't actually make an impact without addressing some of these other issues. And yeah, I think there's so much to talk about that we can probably spend
I don't think that
episodes on.
digital health is always a kind of cheaper, better, worse version of great medicine. I think sometimes it challenges the status quo. I think that it can come in and question the efficacy of really traditional medicine, and as you think about this kind of, when I was working at Mayo, we did a lot of the kind of journey to digital, and what happens is it's a bit like kind of when which animals are getting on the ark, like you kind of like what's working, and by having to kind of deconstruct an area of medicine to kind of figure out how you take it to digital, you question an awful lot of orthodoxies about saying, well, does this come with us? And they're like, well, that's that has to go because we've always done it that way. And then does this come? And that disassembly and the reassembly challenges an awful lot of like looking at just how good is this care. And I think you're right, Kurt. It's not about kind of taking traditional care and creating a mirror of it. I think that filter that you pass through to become digital should, if you're good, force you to really question, how can you change the medicine? Not just how can you mirror it or mimic it or make a cheaper version of it. How can you fundamentally change it? By only, by kind of challenging what hasn't worked. It kind of forces you to expose some of the flaws. And I think that digital medicine, when things go digital, it's the one time that you really examine some of these orthodoxies that people assume, well, that's, we've always done it that way, so we should just keep doing it that way.
I think, and it may be interesting as a discussion at some point, but I think the worldview is just so different also. And, one of the key points is that traditional medicine where I am is not biomedical medicine. Traditional medicine is medicine that is thousands of years old, that is practiced by indigenous people. So you have a completely different worldview in terms of how we're even using these terms, actually. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, sorry. I'm thinking very much of Western medicine.
No, I'm not saying it, but what I'm saying is that the worldview is so different that the way we're going to approach this is going to be different even. So if you're thinking about it challenging biomedical medicine, I'm thinking about it also challenging traditional medicine as it is here, and what are the consequences of that are different from the system that you want to be challenging, right? And so that's the different issues we need to look at.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about kind of digital therapeutics in a landscape, right, of different, it's essentially, we're talking about, is it going to replace medications, or is it going to complement them? Really, digital therapeutics, the simplest way to think about it is that it's just another treatment modality, right? So you have medications, you have surgery, and you have surgical medical procedures, you have therapy, psychotherapy in the case of mental health, you have physical and occupational therapy, you have neurofeedback, right? You have all these treatment modalities. And for any one condition, there may be more than one treatment modality with its own risks and benefits that are discussed with a patient, that are, that there's shared decision making with a patient. I don't want to get gastric surgery. I'd rather take proton pump inhibitors for my gastric ulcer. I don't want to get surgery, right? Because it depends on the situation. So I think digital therapeutics is kind of has its own now bucket as a complementary treatment modality. And in some cases, it might long term, if the evidence base is strong, it might replace some of the quote traditional modalities, or in some ways, it might just complement them.
I think it's an interesting point with technology, though, isn't it? And especially in the case of mental health and talk therapy, CBT, psychological therapy. If I was to sit in a space where you are, Kirti, and talk to a psychologist, I'm sure I would get a culturally different phenomenon and something that was nuanced to what I would need to what I'm going to get if I go to the States and experience it. It's going to be a different, but if I take the technology, because the technology is infinitely, which is why everybody's so interested in it, is because I can build it once and give it to everybody and make money from everybody. But it's going to be this, it's effectively the way it's being built today is I'm going to drop the same thing into your world as I have in the US, and that's potentially, culturally jarring.
Kirsty, that must happen with kind of, I'm assuming with kind of the kind of pharmacy right now. I'm assuming that you develop a drug in the West and the same thing, because I think, David, to your point, there's a kind of globalness in terms of drug development, and then trying to kind of basically say we've developed a drug, we've probably tested it again, maybe kind of in a Western context, and now we're selling it globally, and it's not been tested and it hasn't been considered contextualized into any kind of local communities. So I think that's already happening. Like, this is not, I don't think digital therapies are creating any of this problem. I think this problem exists already. I think, Kirti, to your point, the system already is doing this, and the problem
and that's
is
what I was saying, the system is. But it's like, why mimic the same system if you have a new technology? I mean, I agree with Igor. It is looking at different options, as we've done as health professionals, always choosing the appropriate one for the person that you're seeing. And adapting, because to Lorna's point, we do have to adapt for whatever we have. And so, it is incorporating all of those, but it's considering it as in these discussions, and hopefully the people who are actually doing this.
I think on that note, I think it's a good place to start to wrap this one up, because I think it's been a wide ranging discussion, and we've talked about a lot of things. Right, we've talked about what therapeutics are, where they can be used, the evidence development around them, which is really complicated and is a totally different evidence base and a way of gathering that to what we've done traditionally. And then I think it's really into, as you've described, Kirti, the systems, the goals, the purpose of what we're doing, thinking about that first and trying to get that right, as opposed to chasing the new technology and the best ideas just for the sake of implementing a technology. Like you've said, Igor, that's not going to change or help. It needs to be stuff that's built to solve a problem, to augment what we have today, to work as a therapeutic or as a tool, the same as a drug or the same as a surgery that we have in today's world, with a strong evidence base behind it, done in the right way. And then hopefully, and with a global view and with nuances and acknowledgement of the fact that things are different around the world. If we could do all that right, we'll be doing really well. It's just a suggestion, but I think it's a good place to stop for today.
Yeah, let me just quickly just to quickly jump in, or like ask a few kind of final words. But I think I do some consulting with digital health startups, and oftentimes these startups don't even have any clinicians on their team, and aren't even consulting with clinicians, right? They had a personal experience with cancer or a family member, and they were, wonderful. They were motivated to do something about it, but they haven't really, usually they're like early stage startups. They haven't really done a lot of design thinking involving kind of patients or clinicians. And so, I think there are a lot of emerging digital technologies are so exciting, and people are looking for a problem to solve, and it should be the other way around, right? And so my very first question, one of the first questions that I ask when I'm talking to kind of early startups with digital health is kind of what is going to be the impact of your technology? Like, forget about all the technical, forget about all the exciting things that you're doing and how it's 1% better than the previous technology, right? And what is the impact? And I kind of go back to the quintuple aim, right? The quintuple aim. So in my mind, and this applies to VCs. VCs need to be smarter about this and invest money where actually there's impact. Because there's the more likely the digital health startup will make an impact, the more likely it's going to produce financial ROI, return on investment.
It
So
has to
like,
be problem first.
so it's, so quintuple aim. My question is always, how is your digital health tool going to improve patient outcomes, decrease costs, improve patient experience, improve clinician wellness and experience, and address equity. That's the quintuple aim. And if it's not addressing at least one or two of those quintuple aims, then that is the first question that needs to be addressed by the digital health, by the team, because it's not going to have traction.
But the big challenge, and I've used this example in a discussion I was having recently, is that there's 500,000, we said there's 500,000 health apps roughly in the world in circulation. When I was a younger guy and I was trying to make some spare cash, I went and mowed the neighbors' lawns and I went and painted their houses. When people of that age today are thinking about what to do, they're downloading Flutterflow, buying a Firebase and creating an app. That's the reality. And the barrier to entry is actually very easy to get an app in, get it in the App Store and create something like this.
I shoveled snow of the neighbor's driveway.
Well, there you go. We all had our own nuances. We weren't necessarily building apps at 16, 17 and 18 though, which is where these guys are starting. By the time they got to 21, they're pretty proficient technologists. And they're then throwing stuff in. Health is a big market. It's something that a lot of them are going for. And they don't really understand the nuances of the health space, nor is there any quality. Some of them are fantastic and they've consulted clinicians and they've tried to understand the problems they're solving, absolutely. But a huge amount of them are just building stuff and throwing it out there for the sake of it. And it's really hard to solve, to kind of sort the wheat from the chaff. And that is the challenge. It's the barrier to entry. If you're going to bring a drug to market, you've got, like, that's a whole different ball game. How do you create that? How do you there's a whole load of different issues there. But to get an app into the App Store, far, far simpler.
Like they say, there's an app for everything.
There's probably about 10 apps for everything.
It's a challenging one, because do we want to put barriers? Because are we then going to like miss the opportunity? But then we just do feel that, from like what we've discussed tonight, and the angles that we've looked at it, is that there does need to be a little bit more like forethought and consideration potentially to achieve Lorna's vision, to get that vision. But do we need that pyramid? Do we need that 500,000 to get there? I don't know. Or is it we need hydrogen technology or whatever it is going to be to make sure that we've got servers that can cope with all this, and then we'll get there.
Quantum
Computing. There you go. Solution to all life's
well,
problems.
speaking of quantum, breaking news. Did you guys see that? Cleveland Clinic is collaborating with IBM. They just installed, there's a video, a time lapse. They just installed the first quantum computer dedicated to health and life sciences at the Cleveland Clinic.
Yeah, I liked it.
I saw that.
So IBM is going for a second round.
Yeah, they're giving it another go.
I mean, look, I personally love IBM. They're a fantastic company with a rich history, and they've done a lot of good. IBM Watson was kind of not a great experience for them, obviously, but like they are a leader in quantum, from what I understand. But
Well, on that note, I'm going to wrap this one up because I think we could go on forever here. Guys, thank you very much for your input. Thanks to the panel. Thank you to you for listening to us. We'd love to get any feedback from you. If you've got feedback on this episode, if you've got feedback on the topic, please do get in touch. Follow us on social, visit us on mmb.fm, and as always, keep making medicine better. See you next time.